Mayersville, Mississippi, 1921. The old Negro gardener drifted through town with his gaze fixed on the ground, tending roses in white folks' yards, as unnoticed as morning mist. They called him Old Sam and compensated him with leftover meals and spare coins. Harmless, forgettable, just another relic from the days of slavery who understood his place. Yet when lawmen pulled him into the red brick county jail on a sticky August night, Sam Walker did something completely unexpected. He smiled. What began as a routine inquiry involved a young prosecutor from Jackson, William Thornton, who had been examining unsolved Civil War cases, seeking patterns in county documents neglected during Reconstruction's upheaval. 15 deaths spanning 1860 to 1865. All former slaveholders, all recorded as accidents or natural causes amid wartime confusion. The consistencies were too exact to dismiss. Comparable techniques. Geographical concentrations in Mississippi Delta counties. Victims with documented histories of extraordinary brutality. When investigators eventually discovered a common element, a young enslaved individual present at or near each property during every death, they located him 60 years later tending roses in Mayersville. Old Sam didn't flee, didn't fight. Rather, he reached inside his weathered coat and produced a leather-bound journal wrapped in oilcloth, preserved for 56 years. 50 pages containing names, dates, and locations, 15 slave masters, 15 flawlessly executed deaths across 5 brutal war years. You want to know about murders in this county? The 69th year, old man said calmly, his voice steady as a preacher's. I can tell you about every single one, because I'm the one who did them. The room fell silent. The last shadow was finally prepared to share his story. Before we proceed with this criminal tale, remember to subscribe to the channel and mention which city you're watching from. Let's continue. Samuel Walker entered the world in 1852 on an extensive cotton plantation beside the Yazoo River in Issaquena County, Mississippi, one of the counties containing the highest concentration of enslaved people in the entire nation. His mother, Abeni, was an African woman stolen from her homeland and compelled to labor in fields stretching endlessly under a pitiless sun. His father remained unknown, likely one of the white overseers or perhaps the master himself. Men who helped themselves to women powerless to refuse. Sam never learned which, and his mother never discussed it. Her silence on the matter, as heavy as the cotton sacks they dragged from dawn until darkness consumed the fields. The plantation where Sam spent his childhood was a domain of cotton and cruelty. In 1859, when Sam reached 7, Mississippi shattered all prior records by harvesting over 1.2 million cotton bales. That number represented countless hands picking until they bled, countless backs bending until they broke, countless lives diminished to production statistics in ledgers maintained by men who viewed humans as livestock with monetary worth and nothing beyond. Sam belonged to those statistics. A child whose small fingers learned to pick cotton bolls before learning to write his name. Whose back learned the overseer's whip before understanding why some people were considered property, while others were deemed human. The overseers on that plantation proved exceptionally brutal, even by Mississippi slavery's savage standards. They organized enslaved workers into gangs moving through cotton fields like flesh and blood machines, and anyone falling behind or displaying weakness encountered the whip, the brand, or worse. Sam witnessed men beaten unconscious for picking too slowly, their bodies abandoned in fields as warnings to others. He witnessed women violated in slave quarters while everyone pretended not to hear the screams, understanding that interference meant death. He witnessed children sold away from mothers, dragged screaming to wagons bound for Louisiana, Texas, or Alabama plantations, places they'd never return from. Families shattered, permanently for a few $100 that white men counted while sipping whiskey on their verandas. But what burned permanently into young Sam's soul, what would shape every subsequent day of his life, occurred when he was 8 years old during the summer of 1860. His mother, Abeni, exhausted from picking cotton beneath the brutal Mississippi, sun-transformed fields into furnaces, collapsed between the rows. She had been sick for days. Fever, chills, weakness, but enslaved people received no sick days. You worked until you dropped, and if you dropped, you faced consequences, making work through illness seem merciful. The overseer, a red-faced man named Thomas Morrison, who perpetually reeked of whiskey and sweat, his belly hanging over his belt like a grain sack, accused Abeni of faking illness to avoid labor. These Hado Queen will try anything to avoid honest work, he announced loudly to gathered overseers. He ordered her whipped as an example to remind everyone what happened when you attempted to cheat a white man of productivity. 20 lashes became 30 as Morrison worked himself into fury. 30 became 40 as Abeni's screams transformed to whimpers and then silence. She never rose. She died there in the cotton field, her blood mingling with red Mississippi soil, staining the white cotton bolls surrounding her body, while Sam watched from 30 feet away, held back by other enslaved people who understood that if the boy ran to his mother, Morrison would kill him too. The overseer who killed his mother walked away laughing, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. Lazy. Hey. Couldn't handle a proper whipping, Morrison told another white man loudly enough for everyone to hear. Wes, she wasn't as strong as she appeared. Well, that's 400 worth of property gone. Master won't appreciate that. He laughed again as if he'd made a joke. That night, kneeling beside his mother's body before they threw her into an unmarked grave with other dead slaves, Sam made a promise consuming the next 5 years of his life. Every man participating in her death, every man profiting from this torture system disguised as agriculture would pay. He didn't know how yet. He was merely an 8-year-old child with no power, no rights, no future beyond more cotton fields and more brutality. But he would learn. He would wait, and he would remember every single face. When the Civil War erupted in April 1861, Sam was 9 years old. The plantation descended into chaos as white men departed to fight for the Confederacy, determined to preserve their right to own human beings, leaving properties in overseers' hands, who became even more vicious in their employers' absence. With many white men gone to war, the remaining overseers, too old, too sick, or too cowardly to fight, ruled their domains with increased brutality, desperate to control enslaved populations, whispering about freedom approaching with the Union Army. In late 1861, Sam was transferred to the Homachito Plantation on Mississippi's riverside, one of several massive properties owned by Stephen Duncan, among the wealthiest slaveholders in the entire South. Duncan owned over 1,000 enslaved people across his various plantations, and Homachito was his crown jewel, a sprawling empire of cotton, sugarcane, and human misery generating profits most men couldn't imagine. Duncan himself had fled to New York at war's outbreak, a unionist opposing secession, but having no problem profiting from slavery, leaving his properties under brutal managers determined to extract maximum productivity regardless of human cost. At Homachito, Sam learned to observe with intensity far beyond normal childhood curiosity. He had already learned survival's first rule. Every enslaved child learned that staying alive meant being noticed as little as possible by white people. Becoming invisible, a shadow moving through their world without drawing attention. But now Sam took it further, much further. He studied plantation geography, with a military strategist's intensity planning a campaign, the shortcuts between sugarcane levees, where someone could move unseen. the cypress swamps where someone could disappear forever, the delta channels and bayous where bodies could sink into mud and vanish completely, the locations where quicksand waited beneath innocent-looking water. He learned which overseers drank heavily and when their vigilance dropped to nothing. He learned who had enemies among white managers and overseers themselves, what grudges festered, what rivalries could be exploited. He learned that even monsters had weaknesses if you watched long enough and patiently enough. Bad knees making certain movements difficult, failing eyesight making them vulnerable in dim light, heart conditions they tried hiding, addictions making them predictable. He memorized routines, paths, habits, every detail that might someday prove useful. He also learned to read and write, a crime punishable by severe beating or death, if discovered, because literacy in an enslaved person was considered dangerous by those understanding that education and freedom were inseparable. An elderly enslaved man named Abraham, who had somehow learned his letters decades before and hidden that knowledge his entire life, secretly taught Sam in slave quarters' darkest corners at night, using charcoal on bark pieces that could be quickly destroyed, if necessary. Knowledge is the only thing they can't take from you unless you let them. Abraham whispered, his voice barely audible. And someday this knowledge might keep you alive, or help you do something that matters. Something they'll remember long after we're all dust. Sam memorized every lesson, understanding that literacy was a weapon more powerful than any knife. That reading, documenting, and proving ability was power white men had tried denying him. Abraham taught Sam something else too, something proving even more valuable than reading and writing. Abraham had been a healer in his African village before capture, and he still remembered plants, roots, herbs that could cure or kill. In Homachido's surrounding swamps and forests, those same plants grew abundantly, water hemlock causing symptoms mimicking heart attacks, nightshade inducing hallucinations and death, mushrooms destroying livers slowly over days, foxgloves stopping hearts or making them race uncontrollably. Abraham taught Sam to identify them all, extract their essences, calculate dosages killing without leaving obvious traces. White folks think we're stupid, Abraham said one night, his ancient hands sorting dried plants by moonlight. They think because they can read and we can't, because they own land and we don't, because they have power and we don't, that we're less than human. But we know things they've forgotten. We know old ways, plant ways, ways needing no books or laws. Remember this, boy. Knowledge is power, and they can't take what they don't know. The first killing happened in October 1860, just 2 months after Abeni's death. Sam was still 8 years old, barely more than a child, but rage and grief had aged him in ways invisible on his face. The target was Thomas Morrison himself, the overseer who had whipped Sam's mother to death. Morrison had celebrated that evening by drinking even more heavily than usual, boasting to other white men about teaching that uppity Hindao thing a lesson, and how other slaves would work harder now that they knew Malinger's fates. Sam watched Morrison stumble from the overseer's house toward the privy in darkness, too drunk to carry a lantern, confident in his knowledge of the path he'd walked 1,000 times. What Morrison didn't know was that Sam had spent 3 previous nights carefully digging a hole in that path, 3 feet deep, covering it with thin stick lattice overlaid with dirt and leaves. The covering held a child's weight, but would collapse under a full, grown man, especially one as heavy as Morrison. Morrison's scream when he fell was brief, cut short by his head striking the exposed tree root Sam had positioned at the hole's bottom. Sam had studied that route for hours, calculating angles and depths, understanding that falling from that height onto that particular surface would crack a skull like an egg. Morrison was dead before anyone found him next morning. The death was ruled an unfortunate accident. Drunk overseer fell in darkness and broke his neck. Nobody investigated. Nobody cared enough. Overseers were replaceable, and Morrison's drinking was well known. That night, Sam stole paper and pencil stub from the plantation office, items that could get him killed if discovered. In his careful handwriting taught by Abraham, he wrote, "Number 1, Thomas Morrison, Overseer. Justice delivered October 15, 1860. Crime, murder of a Bainey Walker. Payment, death by fall. Neck broken, alone in darkness." He hid the paper under a loose slave quarters floorboard, beginning a record growing over the next 5 years. The second killing came in January 1861, 3 months later. The target was Henry Caldwell, a slave trader who had visited the plantation the previous year and purchased Sam's 6-year-old sister Sarah, separating her from Sam and their mother despite Bainey's desperate pleas and offers to work extra hours buying the child back. Caldwell had laughed at Bainey's tears, telling her that deeping children belong where they fetch best prices, not where their mammies want them. Sam learned Caldwell was returning to inspect new stock for potential purchase. The trader stayed overnight in the big house guest quarters, comfortable accommodations for a white businessman. Sam working as a house servant, a position he'd maneuvered into specifically for access, brought Caldwell his evening brandy and tobacco. What Caldwell didn't know was that the tobacco had been carefully treated with water hemlock extract, enough for severe symptoms but not immediate death. Sam wanted Caldwell to suffer. Over 6 hours, Caldwell experienced increasingly severe chest pains, breathing difficulty, and irregular heartbeat. By dawn he was dead, and the plantation doctor, not wanting to offend the master by suggesting anything wrong with his hospitality, ruled it a heart attack, tragic, but not suspicious. Caldwell had been overweight and lived excessively. Such deaths were common. Nobody thought to examine tobacco or brandy. Nobody suspected the 8-year-old slave child who had served drinks with downcast eyes and trembling hands. Number 2, Henry Caldwell, slave trader. Justice delivered January 12, 1861. Crime, purchase and removal of Sarah Walker, age 6. Payment, death by poison, heart failure. Died in pain. Sam added the entry to his hidden record, his handwriting growing more confident with each word. The war's outbreak in April 1861 provided Sam perfect cover for his vengeance campaign. War's chaos meant less oversight, more confusion, more opportunity. White men were distracted by battle news, Union invasion fear, plantation profitability logistics, while supporting Confederate war efforts. Enslaved people were moved between plantations as white men departed to fight, creating fluid population where one child more or less went unnoticed. Between 1861 and 1865, Sam moved through Mississippi like a ghost, sometimes officially transferred between plantations, sometimes simply walking away and appearing elsewhere, using war's chaos as cover. He was a child, then young teenager, and white people paid even less attention to enslaved children than adults. He could move through spaces, hear conversations, access areas forbidden to adult enslaved men. He used every advantage. The third killing in August 1861 targeted James Whitmore, a plantation owner who had branded his enslaved workers like cattle, burning his initials into their shoulders. Sam gained access to Whitmore's plantation as part of an enslaved children group being trained for house service. Over 2 months, Sam carefully contaminated Whitmore's food with small bacteria amounts cultivated from rotting animal carcasses, amounts too small for immediate illness, but sufficient to accumulate over time. Whitmore died from what doctors called aggressive infection of unknown origin, suffering greatly before death. His slaves watched him die and felt no pity. The fourth death, in December 1861, was a sheriff named Crawford who had led slave catching patrols hunting runaways with dogs and returning them to torture. Crawford drowned in the Yazoo River in what appeared a fishing accident. His boat had a slow leak. Tiny holes Sam had drilled and plugged with wax dissolving in water. By the time Crawford realized his boat was sinking, he was too far from shore. They found his body a week later. The fifth killing in March 1862 targeted Benjamin Jackson, an overseer known for raping enslaved women. A ceiling beam in his cabin collapsed while he slept, crushing his skull. Sam had spent 4 nights carefully sawing through the beam, until only a thin shell remained, calculating exactly when it would give way. The death was ruled an accident in poorly maintained building. The sixth death in July 1862 was Colonel Richard Ashford, a Confederate officer commanding units hunting runaway slaves during the war. Ashford died of apparent heart failure during a home visit from the front. Sam, working temporarily at Ashford's plantation, had replaced Ashford's medicine with mixture containing foxglove extract. The heart attack appeared natural for a man under war stress. The seventh killing in November 1862 targeted William Harrison, a judge who had sentenced enslaved people to brutal punishments for minor infractions. Harrison died from what appeared food poisoning, but was actually botulism Sam had carefully cultivated and introduced into preserves served at Harrison's table. The agony lasted 3 days. The eighth death in February 1863 was Matthew Sullivan, a merchant grown rich supplying plantations and cheating enslaved people on rare occasions they had money to spend. Sullivan's store burned with him inside, apparently from a knocked-over lantern. Sam had ensured the fire started in multiple locations and Sullivan's exit was blocked. The man died screaming. The ninth killing in June 1863 targeted Nathan Pettigrew, a banker who had financed slave trading expeditions and foreclosed on any free black people trying to own property. Pettigrew was found dead in his office of apparent suicide, a pistol in his hand, single shot to the head. Sam had arranged it carefully after rendering Pettigrew unconscious with chloroform, positioning body and gun to suggest self-inflicted death. Nobody questioned it. The war was causing many men despair. The 10th death in October 1863 was Edward Beaumont, a planter who had separated more families than any other in the county, selling children away from parents for profit. Beaumont died when his horse threw him during a hunt, his neck broken in the fall. Sam had carefully frayed the saddle girth so it would snap under stress and positioned sharp stones where Beaumont would land. The death looked like a tragic accident. The 11th killing in January 1864 targeted George Williamson, an overseer who had invented elaborate tortures for enslaved people displeasing him. Williamson was found frozen to death after a winter storm, apparently having gotten lost in woods while drunk. Sam had lured him into the swamp with false runaway slave information, then ensured he couldn't find his way out as darkness and cold closed in. The 12th death in May 1864 was Charles Rutherford, a slave auctioneer who had made fortune on the auction block, taking pleasure in families being torn apart. Rutherford died of a stroke, sudden and massive. Sam had been systematically poisoning him with small blood pressure, raising substances causing arterial damage, a slow process culminating in catastrophic brain hemorrhage. The 13th killing in August 1864 targeted Daniel Prescott, a doctor who had performed medical experiments on enslaved people without anesthesia, claiming black people didn't feel pain like whites. Prescott contracted a mysterious illness, causing excruciating full body pain before death. Sam had exposed him to certain plants, causing nerve damage and agonizing sensation. Prescott experienced everything he had inflicted on others. The 14th death in December 1864 was Samuel Pierce, a Confederate captain who had ordered black Union soldiers executed rather than treating them as prisoners of war. Pierce died in what appeared friendly fire during a skirmish. Sam had followed Pierce's unit for weeks, waiting for battle conditions providing cover. In gunfire chaos, one more shot went unnoticed. Pierce died believing he'd been hit by Union forces. The 15th and final killing came in March 1865, just weeks before war's end. The target was Marcus Aldridge, the Homocido Plantation manager, where Sam had spent years observing and learning. Aldridge had been present when Abaney died, and had approved Morrison's decision to whip her. He had participated in countless other cruelties, raped numerous enslaved women, ordered beatings and brandings and mutilations. He represented everything Sam hated about the system, destroying his mother and childhood. Sam was now 13 years old, no longer a child but not yet a man, hardened by 5 years of killing and hiding, and moving through a war-torn landscape. He had learned to be a ghost, a shadow, a presence people saw but didn't register. For Aldridge, he planned something special, something making a statement even if no one understood it at the time. Aldridge died in his bed, apparently of natural causes, heart failure in sleep. But Sam had spent hours in that room after Aldridge fell into his nightly drunken stupor. He had used a chloroform-soaked pillow ensuring Aldridge wouldn't wake, then arranged the body carefully, peacefully. On Aldridge's chest, he placed a small paper with words meaning nothing to anyone finding it, but everything to Sam. The last shadow fell across your face. Justice for Abaney Walker and all the others. 15 debts paid in full. The war ended in April 1865. The 13th Amendment was ratified in December 1865, officially ending slavery throughout the United States. Sam was 13 years old, officially free according to law, but carrying secrets haunting him for the next 56 years. He had killed 15 men between ages 8 and 13, documenting each death in a journal he kept hidden and constantly moved, wrapped in oilcloth protecting it from moisture and time. For decades after the war, Sam lived quietly, moving from place to place, taking whatever work he could find, never staying anywhere long enough for deep connections or attention. He never married, never had children, never spoke of what he'd done during war years. He became Old Sam, a shuffling figure tending gardens and fixing things, as much a part of the landscape as trees he pruned. But he kept the journal, adding to it over the years, not more deaths but more evidence. He collected newspaper clippings about his victims, their obituaries painting them as heroes and respected citizens. He added documents stolen or copied over years, bills of sale showing humans purchased as property, letters describing plantation business, accounts of punishments and separations and sales. The journal became a historical record, proof his victims had been monsters, even if white society chose remembering them as respectable men. In 1920, a young prosecutor named William Thornton took office in Jackson, Mississippi. Thornton was unusual for his time and place, a white Southerner believing Reconstruction hadn't gone far enough. That failure to hold former Confederates and slaveholders accountable had poisoned American society. He began reviewing old Civil War cases, looking for death patterns, ruled accidents, or natural causes, but seeming suspicious retrospectively. Thornton noticed something investigators 60 years earlier had missed: 15 deaths between 1860 and 1865, all men connected to slavery's most brutal practices. All in Mississippi Delta counties, all ruled non-suspicious despite some unusual circumstances. He began mapping deaths geographically and chronologically, looking for connections. What emerged was a movement pattern suggesting a single actor. Someone young enough avoiding suspicion, mobile enough moving between plantations, knowledgeable enough about poisons and accidents, making deaths appear natural. Thornton Cross referenced plantation records looking for enslaved people present at multiple locations during relevant time periods. The name Samuel or Sam appeared in fragmentary records from several plantations. Always a child or young teenager, often described as quiet or smart for a harda, duckpeen or good with plants. Thornton tracked down elderly former enslaved people who had lived through that era, asking careful questions about children they remembered, unusual deaths, whispered slave quarters stories. An old woman in Vicksburg told him about childhood rumors of the last shadow. A figure enslaved people spoke about in hushed tones, a ghost punishing worst masters and overseers. "We never knew who he was," she said, her ancient eyes distant with memory. "Just knew that sometimes when a truly evil man died, we'd find a tiny mark somewhere, a scratch on a doorframe, a symbol in the dirt. Meant the last shadow had been there. Meant justice had come." It took Thornton 18 months tracing Samuel through fragmentary records and oral histories, following a trail leading finally to Mayersville, Mississippi, where an old man named Sam Walker had lived quietly for decades, known for garden skill and keeping to himself habit. When Thornton showed Sam's photograph to the old woman in Vicksburg, she stared long moments, then nodded slowly. That could be him. That could be the last shadow all grown old. On August 15, 1921, Deputy Sheriff Tom Harrison and Prosecutor William Thornton arrived at Sam's small shack on Mayersville's outskirts. They expected questioning a frightened old man who might or might not have information about deaths occurring over half a century ago. What they found instead changed both their lives. Sam sat on his porch as if waiting. He was 69 years old, his hair white, body bent from decades of hard labor, hands gnarled with arthritis, but his eyes remained sharp, clear, focused. When Harrison explained they were investigating Civil War deaths and had questions, Sam smiled, a strange expression not reaching his eyes. "I've been wondering when someone would finally figure it out," Sam said calmly. "Took you long enough. 56 years I've been carrying this." He stood slowly, joints creaking, and went inside his shack. He emerged carrying a leather-bound journal wrapped in oilcloth, preserved carefully over more than half a century. "Everything you need is in here. Names, dates, methods, evidence of their crimes. I'm 69 years old and tired of carrying secrets. Time for truth to come out." Thornton opened the journal with shaking hands. The first page read, "The Last Shadow, a record of justice delayed but not denied. 15 debts paid between 1860 and 1865. By Samuel Walker, born into slavery 1852, freed by law 1865. Freed in spirit, never." Page after page of meticulous handwriting documented 15 killings, each with detailed evidence of the victim's participation in slavery's atrocities. There were yellowed newspaper clippings, hand-drawn plantation maps, copies of bills of sale showing human beings purchased and sold, witness accounts collected over decades, and Sam's own careful notes about how and why he had killed each man. Within an hour, Sam was in custody at the red brick Issaquena County Jail. Within 2 hours, word had spread through the county like wildfire. Within a day, newspapers from Memphis to New Orleans had reporters on trains heading to Mayersville. The story was too extraordinary to ignore. An elderly Negro man had confessed to being a serial killer of slaveholders during the Civil War, starting when he was just 8 years old, and he had documentation proving every claim. At the jail, under flickering electric lights, still novel in rural Mississippi, Sam told his story to a room full of white officials whose faces reflected shock, horror, disbelief, and in some cases grudging respect. He spoke calmly, without emotion, describing each killing in detail. His voice was steady, memory sharp despite his age, documentation so thorough it read like a prosecutor's case file. "Why confess now?" Thornton asked. "You got away with it for 56 years. You could have taken this to your grave." Sam looked at him with eyes that had seen more suffering than most people could imagine. "I'm dying anyway. Doctor says my lungs are failing. Maybe 6 months left. And I want the world to know what those men did. I want their crimes recorded in official court documents. I want their descendants to know their family wealth was bought with stolen lives, and that justice, even delayed by 6 decades, eventually came. He paused, then added, I also want young black people to know we fought back. Not just in big ways making history books, not just Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and Union soldiers, but in small ways too. I was a child, powerless, property, supposedly less than human, but I had a mind and will and sense of justice, and I made them pay. I want young folks to know that even when the system is designed crushing you, you can still find resistance ways. You can still fight back. You can still make them afraid. The case became a national sensation. Northern newspapers called Sam a folk hero, a symbol of justified resistance against an evil system, a child who had fought back against monsters. Southern newspapers called him a murderer who had killed innocent white men, demanding immediate execution. Black newspapers published detailed accounts of each victim's slavery crimes, using Sam's journal as primary source document, treating it as historical evidence of slavery's brutalities. White historians preferred forgetting or minimizing. The NAACP sent lawyers defending him, arguing he couldn't receive fair trial in Mississippi, that victim's crimes were so horrific any killing could be considered justifiable human dignity defense, and that statute of limitations should apply to crimes committed so long ago. White supremacist groups organized jail protests, demanding immediate execution without trial, claiming allowing Sam to live would encourage racial violence and Negro uppityness. Legal questions were complex and unprecedented. Sam had killed 15 men, yes, but all killings had occurred over 50 years ago during a war when Sam himself had been a child then, young teenager, and all while he was legally considered property rather than person. Could someone not legally recognized as human at the time be prosecuted for murder? Did normal justice rules apply to acts committed by an enslaved child against oppressors? Were these murders or acts of war against enemy force? The trial, when finally beginning in January 1922, was chaotic. The courthouse packed daily with spectators, both white and black, though segregated into different sections. Sam's lawyers argued passionately he had been a child soldier in a war against slavery, that victims had been enemy combatants in that war, that everything he did was self-defense and community defense. The prosecution argued murder was murder regardless of victims' past crimes or killer's age, that allowing Sam freedom would encourage lawlessness and racial violence. But before the trial could reach verdict, Sam's failing health made the point moot. The jail was cold and damp, his cell barely heated during harsh winter. He developed pneumonia in late February 1922. Despite his lawyers demanding proper medical care, the county provided minimal treatment. A black man's life, even one at National Controversy Center, still didn't warrant good health care expense in Mississippi. On March 15, 1922, Samuel Walker died in his cell at age 70. He never received verdict. His last words spoken to Prosecutor Thornton, who had developed strange respect for the old man, were, "Tell them I'm not sorry. Tell them I'd do it again. Tell them the last shadow fell across evil men, and for 5 years they were afraid." That's all I wanted, for them to feel what we felt every day. Fear. His journal entered as trial evidence was filed away in the Mississippi Department of Archives and Records. For decades it sat mostly forgotten, though historians occasionally discovered and recognized its significance. In the 1960s, civil rights researchers rediscovered the journal and began using it as primary source document about slavery's aftermath and resistance. Today, it's preserved as important historical artifact, Sam's careful handwriting and meticulous documentation providing insight into slavery's cruelties and one child's extraordinary vengeance campaign. In the end, Sam's story raises questions without easy answers. Was he murderer or justice instrument? Vigilante or hero? Traumatized child becoming killer or freedom fighter, striking back against impossible odds? The legal system says murder, always wrong. But what about murder, responding to crimes so monstrous that law itself was designed protecting perpetrators? What is justice when courts are built by sane people committing crimes? Sam never claimed hero status. In final interview before death, he said, "I'm not asking forgiveness or praise. I'm asking for my mother's suffering to be remembered. I'm asking for those 15 men's crimes to be recorded in history, not buried and forgotten. I'm asking for the world to know that an 8-year-old child looked at evil, looked at injustice, looked at a system designed crushing him, and decided fighting back. That's all. Just remember we fought back. Remember they didn't break all of us. Remember the last shadow fell across their world, and for once, for just 5 years, they were afraid of us instead of us being afraid of them." The people who knew Sam in Mayersville, both white and black, had mixed reactions to revelations. White folks who employed him felt betrayed, horrified they'd had a murderer working gardens for decades. But black folks, especially elderly remembering slavery or having parents surviving it, spoke differently. In quiet home conversations, they called him hero. They said he'd done what needed doing. They said the last shadow had protected them when no one else would. An old black woman who had known Sam for 40 years said it best. "That man tended my roses for 20 years, always polite, always careful, always kind. And all that time he was carrying weight of what he'd done as a child." 15 white men who deserved everything they got. He lived with that his whole life. Never told nobody, never bragged, never acted special. Just did what he thought was right when he was 8 years old, then spent next 60 years living quiet and waiting for someone to finally understand. I don't know if he was murderer or hero, but I know this. He's the bravest person I ever met. Is Sam Walker. Is buried in an unmarked grave in Mayersville Cemetery's black section. His journal remains in Mississippi State Archives, available to researchers and historians. His story is taught in some universities as case study in resistance, justice, and slavery's long shadow. But in the end, he's remembered most by simple fact. For 5 years during the Civil War, from age 8 to 13, one enslaved child became the thing monsters feared, the last shadow.